Did you know diasporically, Katherine Dunham played a role in the creation of Brazil's anti-discrimination law? In 1950, while visiting the Black Experimental Theater in Brazil, Katherine Dunham and her group were refused rooms at a first-class hotel in Sao Paulo, the Hotel Esplanada. This was 3 years after U.S. Black anthropologist Irene was refused a room in the Rio de Janeiro's Hotel Cidador. In Dunham's case, suspecting racism, sent her white Canadian husband alone to inquire for a room, and he was immediately accommodated. Clearly racial discrimination, Dunham went to a lawyer to sue the hotel, but was told, "I'm so sorry that this happened with you. It's really a shame. But unfortunately, there's nothing I can really do about it because we have no racism in Brazil. There's no racial discrimination in Brazil. For that reason, we don't have any laws against racial discrimination." The Black Experimental Theater, along with Dunham, took it to the press and drew a wide audience. Oftentimes, foreigners with US or European citizenship have a huge advantage in bringing attention to white supremacist pathology in places where the local population of Afrodescendants are routinely silenced. Adding to this point, and interestingly enough, the Black Experimental Theater presented a series of measures to combat racism to the 1946 Brazilian National Constituent Assembly, but the clause did not pass. This was 4 years before the Katherine Dunham event. The Black Experimental Theater was founded by a group of Black Brazilian men, among them Aguinaldo Camargo and legendary Black Brazilian Pan-Africanist Abdias do Nascimento, in October 1944, after viewing a play in Peru where the white actor was in blackface. The theater was to confront the lack of representation of Afrodescendants and preserve the dignity of Black people in the national performing arts. It also became a site for resistance, activism, and political organizing in favor of domestic workers' labor rights and public policy, organizing the Convention of Brazilian Blacks in 1950. From 1944 to 1961, the company staged leading foreign works and paved the way to the creation of a typically Afro-Brazilian playwriting. Katherine Dunham's case got the attention of white Brazilian Afonso Arinos, a famous legislator. He sponsored a bill that sought to punish racial discrimination, but he erroneously, and in typical white hegemonic style, stated that racism in Brazil came at the hands of foreigners and not the established, long-running, white supremacist power structure Brazil was built on and maintained, stating, "The agents of racial injustices are almost always gringos, who are ignorant of our traditions and insensitive to our old customs of racial fraternity." Obviously, this racial fraternity was in his own twisted mind. It was not the reality of the day, then or now. He claimed his support of the bill was in response to the racism his Black chauffeur faced by Spanish and other immigrants in Rio de Janeiro. In effect, once again, absolving the Brazilian white elite of their racist pathologies. The Brazilian Congress approved this law 1390 in 1951, making racial discrimination in public places a misdemeanor, punishable by jail term or fine. It was named the Afonso Arinos Law after its dishonest author. The law was fueled more so because the event embarrassed the white elite, as it happened to a famous foreigner, and at the behest of Congressman Plinio Barreto, wanted to avoid bringing racial tensions that shape Brazilian society to the forefront, stating the law should be passed as a means to transform the racist mentality that one sees among us, principally in the upper social and political levels of the country, with grave and inevitable consequences for future social peace. I urge you to put a stop to this state of affairs, the worsening of which will contribute to the establishment among us of a genuine battle between the races. In short, he expressed, if discrimination was not outlawed in Brazil, the country would go the way of the United States with its terrible problem of racial antagonism, and although not stated outright, but definitely implied, its loud and visible Black movement. However, and quite predictably, in its 37 years, no one was ever convicted under the Afonso Arinos Law, and it did very little to reduce discrimination in Brazil. During the 1980s, two Black congresspeople, Carlos Alberto Oliveira and legendary Benedita da Silva, the first woman and Afro-Brazilian governor of the state of Rio de Janeiro, introduced a series of bills to strengthen the Arinos Law's provisions. Among them, greatly increased penalties for acts of discrimination. Unsurprisingly, and in typical white Latin American fashion, Afonso Arinos, still in Congress at that point over 30 years later, vehemently opposed this effort for fear of racial conflict, stating, "I don't think it's good, it's inappropriate and inopportune. It might produce a situation of antagonism between blacks and whites," of course conveniently ignoring and intentionally omitting the 500-year legacy of violent, genocidal, white supremacist antagonism. The law 7716/89 was passed under the promulgation of the 1988 Constitution, known as the Citizens' Constitution, which elevated racism from misdemeanor to crime. It also defined racism as a crime against not just the individual, but also against society. Brazil is a signatory to the Convention on the Elimination of All Racial Discrimination. However, this is more in theory than in practice. As Black Brazilian organizations say, the laws need to be strengthened with harsher consequences for guilty verdicts. Dr. Marcelo Diaz, president of the Lawyers Association Commission on Racial Equality, says in Brazil, 95-96% of the judges are white. They have never lived in a favela or shantytown or in the periphery of the cities, where the majority of the Black population live. Many judges don't see it as a serious crime, so it's a crime without punishment. No one has gone to jail for racism. Racism in Brazil has actually gotten worse with the advent of social media and the ability of people to hurl racial epithets anonymously. With the rise of global far-right, white supremacist movements, the election of a white supremacist Brazilian president, all propped up by the rise of racist evangelicals, white supremacists are especially emboldened to carry out racist speech and physical attacks. And that extends to the police state. A Black person is murdered in Brazil every 23 minutes. A Black genocide, many say, with the president calling for even more militarized policing in already marginalized, over-policed Black neighborhoods and spaces, intentional murders of Black Brazilian citizens and community leaders such as Pedro Gonzago and Marielle Franco, with little to no punitive measures, as well as blocked access to healthcare, education, housing, safety, and general human rights. Brazil makes clear whose lives are valued and whose are not, law or no law.